all. I want to acknowledge that we live and work on the Stolo territory, the unceded and ancestral lands of the Stolo people, the people of the river, and the Fraser River plays an integral part in our communities, both as a place of trade, but also as a place of site of history and memory, and a site of reconciliation. We work very hard at the South Asian Studies Institute to commit our solidarity to the movement of Indigenous rights and towards the work of truth and reconciliation. I want to thank the Indigenous people of the communities, our neighbors, the Kwantlen and the Sumac, for allowing us to take from this beautiful land and contribute to society. I thank the University of the Fraser Valley, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Gary Fair, who is our Associate Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies, for joining us. Gary looks after all the institutes and the centers at UFV and is a good friend of India. He has done his PhD work in India and Madhya Pradesh, and so I am pleased that Gary has joined us. Thank you, Gary, for taking the time this morning. This talk is part of a series of talks on caste at the South Asian Studies Institute. We are undertaking the work seriously of dismantling caste as part of our daily practice, as part of our research, and as part of our activities at the Institute. We will spend 2 years focusing on the issues at hand and then move towards a place of reporting back. I would like to let everybody know that we are recording this talk, and until you are going to, I would like all of you to mute your mics, please. I can still hear some feedback from people's mics. So if you have not muted, I would like you to mute yourself, and Sharon, if you're able to mute people as well. I thank you for that. We are recording the talk and we will make it available on our website. So after the talk, whenever in about 2-3 days time, you shall be able to hear Dr. Jodhka again and to spend some time maybe thinking about what he has spoken later as well. Thank you, Dr. Jodhka, for joining us from Delhi this late at night for you, early morning for us, especially with COVID lockdown, with the ongoing farmers' protests, with everything that is happening in Delhi, that you are still able to join us. We are very, very appreciative. Dr. Indaman, who is also from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, Dr. Jodhka's university, is going to introduce Dr. Jodhka in a few minutes. The program is going to go like this. I'll be doing a few words in the beginning, and then Indrajit will introduce Dr. Jodhka. Dr. Jodhka will give a talk, and please make notes as he speaks. And in the chat, you can post your questions. Between Sharon, myself, and Inder, we will curate the questions and pose them to Dr. Jodhka at the end. We are not going to allow a live discussion, probably, because sometimes those can go a little off center. However, if there is something pressing that we want to ask one of the attendees, we will do that in the Q&A. It is my pleasure to speak briefly about Dr. Jodhka's groundbreaking and important research on the topic of caste. Dr. Jodhka has conducted research on caste over the last 20 years in the context of different projects carried out in various regions, mostly in northern India, and his work lies in the treatment of the issue of castes, challenging many flawed conceptions of the reality of caste. For example, caste as a contemporary incongruity, an anachronism, and in an attempt to rectify the sociology of democratic politics. In his recent work on caste, in Dr. Jodhka's opinion, the popular fallacies largely prevailing among the middle class in India or within the scholarship on the topic have gone on long enough, and he suggests that it is time to cripple them. Unlike many evolutionary theorists that have predicted, caste did not inevitably disappear with the dawn of modernity and development. Caste in modern India is not dead, and neither is it dead in the Indian diaspora, far-flung and near. Neither is caste merely surviving because it has been artificially kept alive by the media and government policies, as some have been trying to advocate. Dr. Jodhka writes that far from dying off or even just surviving, caste has shown a tremendous resilience and a strong ability to adapt to the fast-changing society of India. While its organization is evolving, its hierarchical logic is declining, but it is undisputably, undisputably continues to exist as a constantly renewed form of relational discrimination and domination. It is visible and it is complex. Dr. Jodhka insists on the importance of the way the caste question is framed, since it heavily influences the kind of data that is collected. And he says, the meaning and experience of caste changes depending on whose experience of caste is given priority. End of quote. And I would suggest where it is located and situated in terms of the diaspora, where we believe urgent work is needed to deconstruct and dismantle caste-based ideologies, practices, and perspectives. Precisely because viewing caste as a tradition or a form of power, as was usually the case until the 1990s, silences the many discriminations emanating from this social structure. Dr. Jodhka emphasizes the relevancy, not to say the necessity, of generalizing the conceptualization of caste within the framework of prejudice and discrimination. For example, he wants to look at caste as a quote, as a system that institutionalizes humiliation as a social and cultural practice, end of quote. This socially engaged stance, which differs radically from other rather theoretical approaches that have long dominated the scholarship on caste, follows in the footsteps of research in the field of Dalit studies, conducted with the perspective from below for over 20 years, and this study has been approaching power critically. The recent farmers' agitation that has re-engaged all age groups of the Indian diaspora in many countries is also a reflection of the deep anguish of the farming community about the growing chasm between agricultural income for farmers and income for laborers in the sector as part of the Kisan Majdoor Andolan. Farm income is a function of market prices and cost of production. While Indian market prices for major agricultural commodities are influenced by international prices, cost of production is a function of local forces and crop productivity. The current productivity of most of the crops is much lower than the global average. It is in this context that apart from reforms in the market and the supply chain, there needs to be reform for income growth. Agriculturally developed countries are rapidly developing new frontiers of precision agriculture tools. India lags seriously behind. Like the priority given to COVID vaccine, a similar sense of urgency to improve competitiveness of rural Indian farmers and workers is needed to boost their income. Dr. Jodhka recently stated that a binary construct of the rural as simple and urban as rational and scientific has also naturalized the hegemony of the new native nationalist elite over the rural. The rural has thus to be developed by the state, and it was only the urban elite who could understand what was good for the village. The very idea of development has infantilized the villager, and I would suggest by extension the farmer and the laborers. Our lecture today is about how rural Punjab has always been a divided region. Dr. Jodhka's talk is about the most important axis of this division, through caste, which also overlaps with class. Almost all the agricultural land is owned and cultivated by Jatts and a few other minor caste groups such as Sainis, Kambojs, Rajputs, and Labanas. Dalits, who make up more than 30% of the state population, are almost all landless. This presentation will look at how the current farmers' movement has provided an opportunity to rebuild solidarities across caste. Unlike other regions of India, Punjab has the idiom of Sikhi, which could help in building new solidarities across caste communities. We look forward to Dr. Jodhka's talk and the question and answers afterwards. Dr. Inder Maan, who studied at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where Dr. Jodhka teaches, will now introduce Dr. Jodhka.
Hello, everyone. I'm Inderjit Maan, working with SASI as a political scientist. I would like to introduce our today's guest speaker, Dr. Surinder Jodhka. A warm British Columbia welcome, Dr. Jodhka. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your talk. Dr. Surinder Jodhka is a professor of sociology at Center for Social System, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Jodhka's research focuses on different dimensions of social inequalities, old and new, and the processes of their reproduction. The empirical focus of his research has been the dynamics of caste, studies of agrarian social change, and contemporary rural India. Dr. Jodhka is the author and co-author of around 18 books. He has also published over 100 articles, opinion pieces in leading journals and newspapers. Dr. Jodhka's forthcoming book titled Oxford Handbook of Caste in Modern World is releasing in 2021 from Oxford University Press. His recent publications include India's Blazes in 21st Century, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and Mapping the Elite Power, Privilege, and Inequality, also from Oxford University Press in 2019. He is the editor of Routledge India book series on religion and citizenship. He is among the first recipients of the ICSSR Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientist in 2012. He has been a visiting fellow and professor at University of Oxford, University of Lund, University of Berzin, and many more. Uh, so today, Professor Jodhka is speaking about the structure of farmers' movement in India, especially focusing on the role of Punjab to lead this mass movement. Now I request Professor Jodhka to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inder, and thank you very much, Surinder, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion group. I'm really honored, and I hope I'll try to kind of tell you something more than you already know. I'm sorry I decided not to bring in any PowerPoints because I thought it's good to do conversation rather than make formal presentations. I do have some data which we could have talked about, but I think the kind of subject that we are talking about is somehow not amenable to any kind of analytical discussion of that kind. As scholars of social movements would tell us, it's very hard to study ongoing social movements. Social movements are generally studied after some time, after a kind of a lot of, generally people take several, at some level, years before they start talking about something like social movement. So it's still an evolving phenomenon, and it always becomes very difficult because you get subjectively involved. Given that I'm myself a Punjabi and I have some kind of, attachment with the region, and the fact that old people are sitting on border, and you tend to very easily take positions, and you are likely to not see many things which might be very critical to understand these processes. So social movements are generally, any social process for social scientists to study, they need to be in a slightly kind of away from the ground realities. So what I'm going to say is partly kind of based on my understanding and research, historically speaking, because I've been working on Punjab for many years. I've also been working on caste and agrarian change, but it's also at some level, some of it could also be coming from my own location and opinion. So I'm trying to kind of balance the two, and it's better to kind of state it upfront. And I'm not trying to be objective, but I think we need to be kind of analytical and also look at it both from close and from far, what is happening. I suppose most of you would know about the context in the sense that it was in the last week of November that farmers, mostly from Punjab, started marching towards Delhi, and they arrived on 26th, 27th of November in thousands. Initial numbers we don't really know, but by the end of November, there were at least 300,000 farmers present on the borders of Delhi. They initially arrived on the northern border of Delhi, and when they reached at the border, they were obviously not allowed to enter the city of Delhi. And the government of Delhi and the central government offered them a ground which was on the periphery of Delhi, huge ground, and they said that why don't you go and sit down there, and we will make provision for your toilets, for various other things that you may require. But they did not like the idea, because they were worried that once they go and settle down there, A, they can be surrounded by security forces, and then they would not really have much ability to move around, and B, then they can also be forgotten that they can stay there, and this would not create any discomfort for the state and state system. So what they decided is, in the month of November, they just came and sat down on the roads. And these are mostly Punjabi farmers. They came from rural Punjab. And some of you might know that rural Punjab, or Sikhs particularly, have tradition of community kitchens, what we call as langar. And they had brought many of those people along who could cook for hundreds and thousands of people. And they started cooking their langars right on the main road, which is National Highway number 1. It's also called the Grand Trunk Road. It's a huge road. It's like 8 lanes road. So there was plenty of space on the road. They just settled down on that road. And gradually, they also diversified their sit-ins. Besides this main highway that connects Northwest India, Punjab, Haryana, Himachal, Jammu, Kashmir, to the city of Delhi, there are other roads also, which one goes towards the west, which is in Haryana, Rohtak, that is called Tikri border, and they reach there as well. And then there's another border which goes towards UP, and that also was then blocked by the farmers. And the fourth place is the border, that the road that goes towards Rajasthan, and from there on towards Bombay. So these are 4 major entry points. There are 2-3 other places also where initially farmers sat, but these were the 4 sites which they, in some sense, over the next 2 weeks, they had their proper sit-ins. And these sit-ins eventually developed into what I have described in one of my recent pieces as Townships of Protests. And these are very interesting sites to study culturally. And these have become, in some sense, Townships of Protests. And I've been to 2 of them. One of them, actually, the other one, I kind of keep visiting it through social media, through Facebook. But physically, I've not been able to go there because we are also scared of COVID and other kinds of problems. But these are very interesting. There's plenty of visual that is available. You can also visit YouTube, and there's plenty of material, and there are kind of new ethnographies of internet that we can access our sites through. But I keep meeting the activists who are sitting there, and I'm constantly in touch with them. So from first week of November to around 26th of January, the number of people who were there, their number kept swelling. And on 26th of January, they had a special event where nearly 100,000 tractors were to march on the belt roads of Delhi. And they actually arrived. So there were around 1 million farmers present on the borders of Delhi, at least 1 million. It could be more than 1 million. Many of them were from Punjab. I would say perhaps majority of them were from Punjab. But there were also farmers from Haryana, significant number, also from Western Uttar Pradesh, as well as Rajasthan, but also many other states. Uttarakhand is another place where lots of farmers came from, but also from Madhya Pradesh. Some of them also arrived from Maharashtra and southern states in smaller numbers. These are COVID times. Trains are not working. So farmers, those who are interested in coming from other parts of the country, they were not able to come. But still, their number was very, very large. It's kind of, and then there was some problem which, in some sense, made them to call them back. And then most of them went back, those who had come for the special event. But over the last 5 months or so, they are there, right? Even today, if you were to go to all these 4 borders, these townships of protest exist. And they have almost everything they require. They cook langars every day, which is food given to everyone. There are doctors sitting there with medical aid. There are other kinds of facilities available. If you arrive from somewhere and you don't have any bedding for sleeping, they'll provide you some kind of space. Most of the sleeping happens in trolleys, which they connected to their tractors while they were coming. There are mainly 4 borders, as I said, but 2 of the borders about which I'm aware. One is called Singhu border. That is the first place where they came in. that's the place where most of them are actually sleeping in their own tents. They set up, there's a kind of open area, some fields, and the road is also very big. Some of them are staying in trolleys, tractor trolleys, and they have covered them up. But many of them also have put up their small tents. But if you go to Tikri border, where the road is narrow, the stretch goes for around 30 kilometers, where you basically have on one side of the road trolleys parked in a row. And over a period of time, trolley has also come to signify as kind of symbol of protest. And there is a newspaper, let me show you, I have copies of it, which began to be published by some young activists. And this newspaper is called Trolley Times. There's a weekly newspaper which they bring out every week, and these are news of the protest, news of areas around. This is published in Punjabi, in Hindi, and also in English. You can actually open it on the internet and you can read. So there are different ways in which new cultures of protest at some level have come to stabilize there. And at a given time, each of these sites, particularly these two sites, Tikri and Singhu, can accommodate from 50,000 to 100,000 people. And sometimes, their number can go up. And lots of women have also been coming. It's not something which is generally, these protests and farming is identified with men. But we've had times when there are 50,000 women who are staying there. So lots of women are also permanently settled there. Most of these farmer organizations are male-led organizations, but they have very senior leaders who are not the face of organization, but they have been doing a lot of good work. So there's a plenty of involvement of women from farming households who have also been part of these movements. So the movement starts sometime in the month of July, last week of July. Farmers unions in Punjab. Punjab, perhaps most of you would know, is a kind of small state in the northwest of India. It occupies around 1.56% of the total area of the country. And its population is again around 2.6% of the total population of India. So it's a relatively small region, but it is very visible because this is a region which is a Sikh majority region. This is the only state where Sikhs constitute around 60% of the total population. And Punjab also has a very complex history, that it was a much larger region, and the contemporary Indian Punjab is only around 15% of what it used to be, say, 100 years back. So there was larger Punjab, which now larger part of it went to Pakistan. And then the part that came to India, that was also further divided because there were Hindi-speaking regions and non-Sikh majority regions, which was separated from Punjab. Haryana became a separate state. Part of it went to Himachal. So Punjab has had a very interesting kind of agrarian history, and Punjab is also seen as, or it has been seen as, food granary of India. So anytime you talk about agriculture in India, the first place that you would talk about is Punjab. Why did Punjab become so critical? Punjab became so critical because we were talking about, I think Satinder was talking about rivers. I think rivers have their own, all civilizations evolve around rivers. And Punjab is the 5 Abs, the 5 rivers. Ab is a kind of, I think, Persian word which means water. So Punjab is a region from where rivers flow, 5 rivers flow. And because of that river water being available, it was also the region of civilization. The ancient civilization in South Asia emerged around these rivers in Punjab, the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa civilization. And later on also, it's a region which has very distinctive place in the entire region, though we have not really looked at Punjab from that perspective. But I think Punjab has its own history, which is not really just a Sikh history. It's also a civilizational history of India. Everyone comes into India through Punjab, and it's a very complex kind of region in terms of cultural traditions. If you look at Sufi movement or Sikh movement and many other kind of intellectual movements that emerged from Punjab, even Vedas, the ancient texts of Hindus, were actually initially composed, not written, composed in this region called Punjab. So it was a very interesting kind of region. But also when the Britishers came to rule over Punjab, this was one region which actually developed in agriculture. Most other part of India declined agriculturally when the Britishers came to, they introduced their own revenue systems, a complicated story. But India experienced a significant agricultural decline during the late 19th, early 20th century, and through the 19th century actually. And you had serious famines in India during the first half of the 20th century. Punjab was a different story. Punjab was the region where the Britishers actually set up canal colonies. They invested in developing agricultural infrastructure in Punjab, partly because they had their own interests in developing Punjab agriculture, because they wanted to settle the soldiers who had fought for the British, and they wanted to give them land. So lots of Sikh farmers actually, from Sikh cultivators from the eastern side of Punjab were taken to the western side of Punjab, places like Layalpur, Mint Kubri. These were called canal colonies. These were new settlements where these people, mostly Jatt Sikhs, they were given large tracts of land, and they were, in some sense, asked to develop those lands agriculturally. Now, this is also the region which, at some level, sees first major irrigation project after independence, the famous Bhakhra Nangal Dam project, which actually started, it was conceived during the colonial period, but it was developed by the first Prime Minister of India, and he described it as the temple of independent India. These were kind of symbols of new developmental state, which also invested heavily in agriculture, because agriculture was seen as a major kind of source of India's weakness, because they needed to depend on food grain imports from United States of America, which came with certain kind of conditionalities. So also the capitalist bloc at that time, what was known as the First World, was also anxious about the third world countries. I mean, countries like India, which had large population, and they were worried about the Malthusian prediction of population being a kind of time bomb. And the biggest problem at that time, as they understood the American bloc, was food. And they then invested in developing technologies which would help these countries to, at some level, develop their agriculture. And that's how the idea of what we know as Green Revolution was developed. And it was developed to counter, at some level, the growing influence of the Second World, which was led by then Soviet Union. And many of these countries were poor countries, and they were actually attracted to socialist model of development. But Americans also realized that, and they came in and gave a lot of aid and introduced new kind of technological solutions to food problems. And Indian state obviously picked it up, and they thought this was useful. And that's how new seeds were experimented in India, high yield variety seeds, but that was also accompanied by various other inputs. So there was a lot of agricultural investment that happens in Punjab, and then Punjab sees significant growth in its agriculture, and nearly and Government of India begins to develop its own food stocks. And these food stocks then are used for what we call as public distribution system. So in order to incentivize farmers, they also introduce a new kind of procurement system directly from farmers through commission agents, and there were new marketing centers which were set up in each kind of set of villages, from where Government of India would procure whatever food grains are produced at a price which was higher than the market price, which was called as the minimum support price, so that farmers are incentivized to switch over to production of food grains rather than producing other cash crops. So Punjab became a land, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, where wheat was produced conventionally, but also a little bit of paddy was produced. But then they encourage them to also produce paddy, because rice is the staple in most of India. And then Punjab begins to grow paddy. Initially, it was at some level useful, because with canalization that followed Bhakhra Nangal Dam, there was water seepage in many areas, and paddy can consume a lot of water. So paddy was a very good cash crop, but eventually it became a very kind of attractive crop, because rice price was very good in the market. And Punjab also began to export its high quality basmati rice. So paddy becomes a kind of attractive cash crop. And then that has a kind of negative impact on the ecological system of Punjab, because this region doesn't have that much groundwater, and canal water was limited. But people begin to kind of pull out groundwater from underneath. It's actually not simple wells. These are deep down kind of, they are called some other name. And that water is being taken out, and this is kind of very dangerous ecologically for Punjab. It's not sustainable, at the most another 10, 15 years. After that, it would begin to kind of create very serious ecological crisis, signs of which are already there. But at the same time, it was also the interests of the Indian state and the larger Indian population, which Punjab was serving. And it was also benefiting Punjab because it emerges as the most prosperous agrarian region of India. Until 1990, Punjab was the richest state of India in terms of per capita income. And when in 1990s, India introduces economic reforms, the thrust of Indian economy changes completely, and India becomes a kind of corporate led state, and the growth rate which corporate sector experienced up to like 20% increase in its income, 30%, and sometimes even 100%. So overall growth rate of the economy went up from like 2-3% to 8, 9, 10%, 11% also. So Indian economy grows in the 1990s and the first decade of 20th century. But that has a kind of negative implication of on agriculture. With globalization, food grains are available from wherever you want to buy. So agriculture becomes dispensable. You don't really need to worry too much about food, because even if there is food scarcity, you can just go to Australia and pick up as much wheat as you want to at a price cheaper than the price that you pay to the farmer. So this is the time when agriculture begins to be seen as a lag rather than as a resource. So, and that's the time when Indian state stops investing in developing any kind of further infrastructure, further kind of investments in agriculture. And from 90s onwards, farmers' incomes begin to decline. And there is a kind of broad, what we call as, in India is famously called as the Agrarian Crisis. Now, this Agrarian Crisis is reflected most clearly in increasing number of suicide by farmers. Lots of farmers have been committing suicide all across the country, and they are most frequent in regions which were integrated in the market economy, those who are producing agricultural cash crops. Punjab has incidentally not seen too many suicides except for one region of Punjab, which is known as Malwa. But most of the regions of Punjab, for reasons which are linked to Canada, because other regions of Punjab diversified. There is household economic diversification, where one person is working in Britain or in Canada or gone to Australia, and they're sending some income back home. So Punjab remains at some level prosperous. It does not become poor, but its relative position within the Indian Union goes down significantly. From top state up to 1990s, Punjab comes down to like a middling position. Now I think it is at number 10 in terms of per capita income out of 27 or 28 states. It is still higher than the national average, but overall Punjab has declined, and profit from agricultural economy have significantly declined. Even though farmers continue to enthusiastically cultivate their land, but incomes have declined. But the main problem is that the Indian state is somehow looking for a way out of agriculture. It doesn't want to procure food grains from farmers, which they think are sold at a price higher than the price at which it is available in the global market. There is also now food grain production that is happening in other states of India, where you don't have mandis, where you don't have this system of procurement prices, and they are able to buy wheat from other states. So their dependence on Punjab and Haryana and Western UP has significantly declined. So they have been trying to introduce what they call as the reforms, marketing reforms in agriculture. And agricultural lobbies are very strong still in India. I mean, according to the official data, nearly 45% of male workers are employed in agriculture. The number is perhaps slightly smaller, but still agriculture is very kind of, in terms of India is a democratic country to some extent still. So the lobby that agriculture still has is very, very powerful. So they thought that this was the best time to introduce these reforms, because we are in COVID, and this COVID means that nobody can mobilize. They would be politically, much easier to push these reforms. So in June 2020, central government comes up with these 3 new laws. Out of these 3, 2 are new laws, and 1 is actually an amendment. And they are pushed as ordinances. In Indian political system, you can have an ordinance when there is emergency, where the central government in its union's cabinet can pass a law which has to be ratified by the parliament. So these were initially passed as ordinances in the month of June in 2020, and they were ratified later on by the Indian Parliament in September 2020. If you look at the map of this curve of COVID in India, mid-September is the time when India is peaking. In the first peak of later on, the current is kind of still peaking further, but that was the main peak of 2020, September. So that is the time when these laws are introduced. But there were other problems as well, because agriculture is legally a state subject. The provincial government was supposed to deal with agriculture, but in this case, the central government went ahead and introduced them as trade and commerce acts, because they said that these don't necessarily deal with agriculture. They are dealing with their trade and commerce. So they said that we have the right to do it, and that's how they went ahead and did it. Now, what are these laws? Let me briefly say. They basically change the framework of agriculture commodities and their commerce. The first law allows anyone to go and buy from farmers. They don't have to go through these mandis, the marketing centers, which have emerged as a kind of institutions. And these institutions are very critical for farming, because these commission agents are also banks for farmers. They lend them money at a reasonable interest rate, not a kind of low interest rate, but they are kind of, there's a kind of ecosystem. They become part of the agricultural ecosystem. So bypassing them, they allowed private players to come in and buy from land as much as from farmers, and they don't need to register themselves. There's no legal framework within which they would go and buy and contract. You just need a kind of government card once you have, which is called as PAN card or Aadhaar card, and you can buy from farmers. If there is a dispute, there is no system of dispute resolution. So the point is that agriculture markets are opened up to everyone. And second law is a law about what we call as the contract farming, that anyone can contract farmers and ask them to produce a particular crop which they are supposed to buy from farmers later on at some day. And the third law, and this contract law is already there in Punjab and other states, some other states, not everywhere, but this law is a national level framework. The third law was already there in the sense that it imposed limits on what you can store, because only government can store food grains. And this law takes away those limits, that if I have lots of money with me and I have storage space, I can buy all the wheat that is produced in India when it is harvested. And then later on, I can sell it whenever I feel like, because I have the storage capacity. So I would determine the price, as simple as that. So corporate sectors are already building large godowns in this area where they can buy food grains, store them, and then they would release it in the open market. So the farmers, in some sense, feel that these are very clearly initiatives that would increase uncertainties in the agriculture production marketing, that they would have to go and initially they might get a very high price from these private players, and government will withdraw its support price regime, which they helped institutionalize earlier. And once the mandis kind of are dismantled and these commission agents wind up their shops, then farmers will be at some level left to the mercy of these corporate houses. And since agricultural production is always in a glut, there's only just a couple of weeks when they want to sell everything. And these are small cultivators. Somebody has 2 hectares, 5 hectares, 3 hectares. So they don't have the storage capacity. They don't have the capacity to hold on. So they have already debt, and they would be compelled to sell it in the market at whatever price the corporate houses give them. And the support price would be withdrawn. The contract farming will bring them into new cycles of debt with corporate houses, and then they could always change the legal provisions, and then they will end up losing their land. So this is a message that farmers have kind of got from these laws. And Punjab farmers were the first ones to pick it up. And the moment the ordinances were passed, they already had some hint of it, because some of them were actually called by the central government departments to discuss, but they were not taken. Their opinion was not really even asked for. They were asked to just sit down and listen to them. So they had an idea, and as soon as the ordinances were passed, they began to talk about it. And by month of July, you already have some kind of protests happening in Punjab. But at this time, it is happening only in Punjab, because Punjab is a state which, as I said, is most invested in agriculture. Very interestingly, Punjab has lesser number of people who are full-time employed in agriculture than rest of India. As I said, 44% for the all India. In case of Punjab, only 26% of the main male worker, as the census puts it, it's a very patriarchal kind of census, are full-time employed in agriculture. So only 40%, 35 to 40% of rural main worker. Majority of the rural workers are also employed in non-farm occupations, right? But holdings in Punjab are far more viable. Average holding in India is around 1 hectare. Average holding in Punjab is around 3.6 hectares, right? Holdings in Punjab are much bigger, partly because lots of people have left Punjab and they are living in diaspora, and they lease out their land to these enterprising farmers who lease in land from their relatives, from their cousins who go abroad, and also very small cultivators who are left with 1 hectare, half hectare. They have exited from agriculture, and there is what we call as reverse tenancy. So agriculture is taken very seriously in Punjab, and ever since 1970s, Punjab has also had tradition of farm unions. The farmers here they were the first ones to kind of have their unions, and these unions at some level were very what one should say integrated with the realities of farming on the one hand, but at the same time also the realities of market and realities of political process. So Punjab has had very active farmers politics. It starts sometime in the early 70s, and then it peaks in 1980s when there is a farmer movement all over the country. And many people have written on it, the farmers movement in 1980s. But after 1990s, agriculture begins to decline, as I said earlier, with the new liberalization. The new rich in the village, who was also a rich farmer, begins to diversify. His children begin to go abroad, many more, and he himself moves to the city as commission agent in the local mandi, or becomes a political entrepreneur and goes to the city, sets up his own business. These are all men. And that's why I'm very self-consciously using the word his. There's a kind of new kind of what in Andhra Pradesh somebody called as provincial propertied class. So these are diversified households who are actually more invested in urban rather than in rural. You remember I did a survey of 51 villages in 1999, 2000. There were many sarpanches. Sarpanch is the head of rural village council, were actually living in cities. So they had large amount of land, but they wanted their children to study in urban schools. So they would have a small house in the capital city of the Punjab, not in the capital city proper, but in the suburb of Chandigarh, in Mohali, where the women of the house would stay with the children and the men would kind of commute from there. And there would be some kind of settlement in the village also where the old women would stay, and there are some servants. So the big farmers begin to at some level secede from the village, and they develop other kinds of interests. So the rural politics at some level begins to see a very significant decline in 1990s. And the elite that had emerged in 1970s, who were rural agrarian elite, and they became the chief ministers or regional elite of Punjab, they at some level remain in power, but their source of economic reproduction is no longer the village. Their source of political reproduction is village, but their source of aspirational economic reproduction happens outside, in real estate, in grain kind of business, in transportation, and many other things they start doing. This is something which is happening in other places as well. But when agrarian crisis begins to trouble people in the 90s, you have new kind of farmers unions coming up in Punjab in the 90s. These are mostly left-wing unions. I mean, in Malwa region particularly, the biggest union, for example, is right now, it's called BKU Ekta Ugraha, right? So Ugraha is a village, but the leader name is also Ugraha. So these are small unions but they are very well organized and they are basically trying to protect their members, but they're all farmers' unions. And these people are the ones who pick up these, and the old unions are also there. Not that they have disappeared, their leadership remains. For example, Rajewal, who is one of the tall leaders, he was active in 70s when the farmers union started. He was a young man at that time, and he was one of the first ones to start. And he still remains the tallest leaders of farmers union. So you have these combinations, and there are 30 plus of them. There's not one or two or three. There are 32 unions, which are 32 or 33, who are participating from Punjab in this movement. In the month of June, they begin to talk about it. By July, they already have a coordination of 10 unions, and they give a call for some kind of protests. And they start organizing local level protests where they bring their tractors to the town and they block roads. They go and protest outside the houses of MLAs and the local representatives who belong to either the Akali Dal or to the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, parties in power. This is followed by sitting on the railway tracks. And then there are also kind of, what is called as jail bro, fill in the jails. So they give arrests, voluntary arrests in different cities and towns of Punjab. And they keep making noise, and the state government listens to them and tries to do something which it can at the state level, but it was not really state governments doing, and they could not be very effective. But one more thing happens is that Akali Dal, which is a regional party of Punjab, which is not a ruling party in Punjab at this moment, but it has its MPs and it was part of the ruling alliance at the center in Government of India. And they also had a minister. So they realize that this is going to be very difficult for them. And they start lobbying against these ordinances, and they want to convince the BJP not to bring them to parliament and pass them as laws. But the BJP doesn't listen to them, and then they decide to move out of the government. The minister resigns, and when the laws are taken to the parliament, the Akali party also dissociates itself from the ruling alliance in September 2020, around the time when the ordinances are being converted into laws. But then by that time, farmers also begin to realize that it is not really working out. So they give this call that in November last week, we should march to Delhi, because that is where the power lies. And that is when they start coming towards Delhi and eventually reach on 26th, 27th of November. And from there on, they have been sitting there. And as I said, they have set up what we call as townships of protests. And these townships of protests have very interesting kind of protest cultures, right? Every day morning, there would be even kirtan, right? There is a small gurudwara at both the sides. And Punjabi folk music has played a very significant role. Initially, when the protests started, it was the older people, 50 plus farmers, grey beard, who were sitting on railway tracks. And then there are these Punjabi singers led by this person called Kanwar Garewal, and he mobilizes some of them, and they start going to villages and start mobilizing young men that, it is shame on you. Look at your fathers and grandfathers and uncles. They are sitting there and you are sitting at home and doing nothing. There's a lot of unemployed youth in rural Punjab who is educated and doesn't really relate to agriculture. They either want to go to Canada, or they would be taxi drivers, or they just don't do anything hoping to get something. There's a large number of what we call as the time pass youth. And these people were otherwise not doing anything. And then they are inspired and they start joining protests. But when the townships of protests come up in Delhi, you can see this young energy coming there. They are cooking langars, they are participating, but also these young singers. Something like 70 to 100 songs have been composed. If you just go to YouTube and enter Kanwar Garewal, there's a song called Elan. It has like 10 million views. Another song which was sung by this other chap, Daljit Dosanjh, when this woman Rihanna had tweeted, Rihanna was adopted as Punjab's daughter, and then he sang a song which within 3 days had like 8 million views, right? There was another song that Kanwar Garewal and Harf Chima sang, which was banned which was withdrawn by YouTube. I don't know whether it was on the advice of Indian government or what. But there is this kind of very interesting kind of popular culture which develops around these protest sites. And this is where I think Punjabi Sikh farmers come very organized, and they bring all their might. And one of the things that bring along is the idiom of Sikhi, that they would use the idiom of Sikhi in their protest without any kind of guilt or anything. So there is this always a narrative of being anti-national, being Khalistani, being separatist, because they are speaking about, they're bringing their turban and flowing beards and using Punjabi. So government of India tried to do that, but these people didn't become defensive about it. They continued to foreground their Sikhi slogans, and that actually gave them a lot of energy. Right? You can see that we have never lost. We will always win. And then this slogan of Chardi Kalam, that always look up, don't look down. Though lots of people have died on the ground, so this has not really been a picnic, as some people have tried to say. The current estimate is something like 400 people, or something like 375 to 400 people have already died. Some of them have died on these sites of protests. Some of them have died in states. Some of them have died on roads. On the roads of Delhi, living when temperature is 1 degree centigrade, right? That's how they lived through the peak of winter on roads of Delhi. Not that they had no blankets, they had some way to live, but some of them could not survive. Lots of people actually died because of cold and various other things. And now they are entering summer, when temperature go up to 47 degrees centigrade. I don't know whether you use centigrade or Fahrenheit, but 47 degrees is not livable. I mean, it's very, very tough. Now, how come they're able to sustain it, right? If we go back to this is the second part of my presentation. I'll try to complete another 10 minutes or so. If you go to village of Punjab, it is divided on caste, the point that Sir Bain started with. And that is very, very critical, because in rural Punjab, and that's where my work on caste comes from, that when you study textbooks of sociology or anthropology, you think of caste as a ritual system of hierarchy of the Hindus. Now you go to a village of Punjab, there is no Hindu there, right? There could be 5%, 10% Hindus, but they're not really Hindus. They are part of the regional Punjabi culture. And there's no Brahmin. Nobody cares for Brahmins. I mean, Sikhism has no priestly caste. But village of Punjab is completely divided on caste. You go to any village. When I started doing my field work in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, or actually late 90s, that's the time when I started working on caste. My earlier work was on agrarian chain. You could, I mean, the Dalits, for example, would stay on the Lendi side, the side on which sun sets. Now, caste classification has evolved in India, and what we use today is the colonial classification. Colonial rulers began to enumerate castes, and they identified what we call as the depressed classes. And these depressed classes later on were classified as scheduled castes. And these scheduled castes are largely the ones who are treated as untouchables, and they are the marginalized people. The Britishers also described them as non-agriculturists, so they were not allowed to own land. And that has had an impact. Most of the land in Punjab belongs to Jatts. There are 32% of Punjab's population who are listed as scheduled castes, right? So if you go to villages of Punjab, anywhere, Dalits would be the largest community, or one of the largest communities. There would be 30-40% Jatts in the village and 30-40% Dalits in the village. There could be different communities of Dalits. There are among Dalits, there are 40 communities.
Dr. Jodhka, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So I didn't mute myself, somebody else did. But anyway, so the village is divided on caste lines. All the agricultural land belongs to Jatt Sikhs. Jatts are all Sikhs, even though They may not wear turban, like Inderman doesn't wear turban, but he is also a Sikh. He would wear turban when it feels like. But his older people will be wearing turban. When he goes 60 plus, he would start wearing turban perhaps. So you have this culture of being and remaining Sikh in Punjab, rural Punjab, and Jatt Sikhs have no anxiety about their identity. They are all Sikhs, but they are all cultivators and they are all landed. In contrast, Dalits are also all landless. And this relationship has always been relationship of hierarchy, not of inequality. There's a difference between hierarchy and inequality. Hierarchy is far more rigid, and where everyone is, the Jatt Sikh is the superior most caste in rural Punjab. There is nobody above Jatt Sikhs. They don't fit into any classification of Varna. That's why I say the Varna theory of caste is a complete Brahminical conspiracy supported by the colonial kind of Orientalist imaginations of India. But actually, caste is a very material reality. So in rural Punjab, there's nobody higher than Jatt Sikh. They are the superior most caste. There's no ritual part of it. They're also Sikhs, and Dalits would also be Sikhs. But Dalits are considered very low in hierarchy. They are humiliated in everyday life. Things have changed now. I will come to that in a short while. But historically speaking, Dalit women, for example, could be raped by upper caste dominant Jatts, and this would not become an issue. So there were all kinds of exploitations. Dalits would also work on farmlands as attached laborers, bonded laborers, tied laborers, but also regular farm servants. They'll also clean the drains and toilets of people who lived in the village, upper caste people. They would also take care of their cattle. So all kinds of manual work was done by, and they actually called as kammi. Kammi is the one who is a manual worker in literal translation. So these were laborers, bonded laborers of the Jatts. And this relationship has always been very conflictual and full of, I would say, hatred for each other. But Jatt would have contempt for the Dalit, and Dalit would obviously, at some level, there was patron-client relationship also, but it could soon turn into a relationship of conflict. And this was not a class relationship. This was caste relationship. Class is only about labor exploitation, but caste also has this, as Satinder was saying, institutionalized humiliation. They would be treated as inhuman. They would be treated very badly, and they would not have the courage to even come into Sikh Gurudwaras, which are theologically speaking very open. And when they experience some kind of mobility, the first thing they would do is to build their own Gurudwara. So there was a practice of untouchability. But what happens with the Green Revolution, there is a prosperity in rural Punjab, and there is also urbanization of Punjab. Urban centers are very important in Punjab. There's no village in Punjab which has an urban center more than 15 to 20 kilometers away. So every villager in Punjab can cycle to the city and come back in the evening, right? It's a very interesting kind of urbanized landscape that Punjab has. So lots of these Dalits begin to move away from agriculture, and they would say that we would not work as farm servants. Whatever salary you want to give us, we don't care. Initially, there were conflicts in the 70s when the dependence increased and they wanted higher wages, and the Jatt farmers will not give them. Then Jatt farmers began to import labor from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where it was available cheaply. And that's how Dalit became dispensable. So over a period of time, what happened is that caste question, which was a class question, becomes an identity question. Right? So in the 90s, this is a very interesting kind of shift that happens in rural Punjab, that Dalits begin to seek dignity and citizenship, that we should be treated equal. We are citizens of this country and we vote, and we have humanity in us. And then there are conflicts around that. Sometime around the turn of the century, there was a case in a village in Jalandhar district called Talhan. And then it kind of gets I've published on this. If you're interested, I can share those papers with you. So this kind of caste question becomes an identity question, and it becomes a question of citizenship rather than a question of class, because they're not bothered about agriculture. They know that they're landless and they've already diversified into other occupation. Not all of them. So in some pockets, in, for example, Malwa region, where holdings are very large, lots of Dalits also work in agriculture. But something else also happens in the late 90s, and that is the second phase of mechanization of agrarian economy. And after that, very little labor is required in agriculture. So all the agricultural operations, which used to last for 2 months, gets over in 2 weeks' time. So even if you are working as a farm servant of agricultural laborer, your employment from agriculture in a year would not exceed more than 50 to 80 days, right? Unless you're working as a farm servant. So you would have to do other things. So many of these farm servants also do other odd jobs. They'll work on construction sites, they'll go to the city. So you don't really have that kind of conflictual relationship between Jatts and Dalits. But this was not a relationship of love also, right? So the conflicts begin to start over what I call as the common resources of the village, which Jatt assume is their own monopoly, but actually they commonly belong to all. So Dalits would see that the common village pond is also their property. But the Jatts would see that this is our pond and you have never had any rights over it. How dare you claim these common resources for yourself? So these became kind of sites of conflict, and this continues for 10, 15 years. But then there is also reconciliation. Reconciliation happens because Jatts realize that now if we have to reproduce our power in the village, it could not be done without some level votes from the Dalits, because the numbers are very large. And there is a shift in rural power structure where the big men have already moved out of the village. They've either gone to Canada or they've gone to the local city. They're no longer there in the village. The Chaudharis, the people who had big holdings, and they could do anything, they could get people killed. So these people have moved out and they are replaced by a new class of political entrepreneurs. And these political entrepreneurs mostly come from the dominant caste, which is Jatts. But these are people who would want to bring everyone together. And I think farm unions are also led by these political entrepreneurs, and they kind of bring them together. So there is a kind of already a ground created where there is some kind of reconciliation at the village level. Now, when these farmers movement take off, in 1980s, when farmers movement emerged, they were carried out in a language of populism. That village is village, village is agriculture, agriculture is village, and we are fighting against the city, which is elite. So the binary which was constructed by a farmer leader from Maharashtra was that there is struggle between Bharat, which is the native India, with India, which is the elite, westernized, alien, exploitative India, right? So this was the kind of binary, and Bharat was trying to fight for the native spirit and native resources, not any longer, right? When farmers organize themselves now, they realize that their back is to the wall, right? They don't really have that kind of position where they can believe. If they had that position, then these laws would not have come. And the kind of farm unions that emerged, as I said, they already recognize that the village is a divided place. So they begin to articulate a rural question as Kisan and Mazdoor question. Kisan is the farmer, Mazdoor is the worker, right? So it's the alliance of farmer and worker. And that is the slogan that begins right from the beginning. Kisan, Mazdoor, Ekta, Zindabad. Unity of farmer and laborer in some sense. Now, it's a very difficult question to frame it in language of caste. Now, these are all these people who reached Delhi on the borders in the last week of November. I haven't done a survey, but I'm pretty sure, if not 99%, definitely 90% plus, 95% would be Jatts, right? And they would all be Jatt Sikhs, or they are joined by Jatts of Haryana, which is kind of, they also have some kinship affinity, but they come from the same stock. So this is a movement of the Jatts, for the Jatts, by the Jatts, right? And it is movement of agriculture and farming, which is a monopoly of the landed castes, right? Led by Jatts, but there are a few other OBCs who own small plots of lands. Dalits not own land. This is not a movement of the Mazdoor, right? There is no what one should say, question of class that is part of this movement. They're not talking about, say, for example, what should be, how should we shape or determine the wages of laborers, right? Or even other contentious issues. For example, if there is a common land in the village, should it be given to Dalits? Some people are talking about it. So there are no class questions being raised here. But symbolically, because caste question has already become a question of citizenship and identity, this recognition makes a lot of difference. Right? That you're talking about Kisan Mazdoor Ekta, and you're actually recognizing Dalit as a constituency, as separate from us. Even though you are singing praises of Jatts even in your music, but you are also saying that we need Ekka. Ekka is unity, unity of villages, not of the Jatts. Across sections of the rural society, rural Punjab, we need to come together. And over a period of time, what has happened is that every village of Punjab has a small coordination committee which collects money for the farmers movement, because, you know, keeping even 50,000 people on farm sites, every day you need at least 20 lakh, 30 lakh rupees, $500,000, 2 million, 3 million rupees. So where are you going to get that money from? Some of it would come from people like Indar, who are very attached to their village, but most of it will have to be collected locally. So they are mobilizing people from the village who would be at the protest sites, but they're also collecting money. And when they're collecting money, Dalits are not participating in this movement directly, but Jatts are going to Dalit households and also asking them that, symbolically you ought to give us chanda. So Dalit feel very good about it. These Jatts who never spoke to us, now they have come to my house and they are asking for chanda for some kind of donation from me. And then they also ask them, we request you to please join the morcha. Next week we are going from here and we'll take you in a bus and we'll bring you back, and all this expenses will be taken care of. And then finally, that's where Sikhi becomes very important. Sikhism is a religion which emerged around all these fault lines of Punjabi society. And the gurus had already worked it out that, you need to raise question of caste and you need to talk about common humanity, and all those resources are there. And the Sikh Pracharaks, so many of them are Dalits, but most of them are Jatts, or at least at the dominant position, they are Jatts. So these are not things that have been forgotten. Every day we kind of, for example, in Gurudwaras will say, Sarbat Dapala, we wish welfare of all. Now, these are not part of South Asian cultural traditions. South Asian cultural traditions are very exclusionary, Punjab included. And caste would not be included in, as I said, even the villages, Gurudwaras will have caste-based discrimination. Even the major Gurudwaras in India, until 50, 100 years back, they had caste-based divisions, right? But caste has become a major issue in Punjab in last 20, 30 years. And that is being raised in this movement in a very creative way. So there is new kind of solidarity is being built at the village level. So the Jatt who was the arrogant ruler of the village is no longer the arrogant ruler of the village, because village as a site of social life has collapsed. Now, site of social life is the global village, right? The nation state. So the laws are passed by the central government, and they are going to affect the village. Prices of food grains in Canada are going to affect prices of food grains in Punjab. Right? So we are already globalized in a kind of new market economy. And that market economy, the Jatt is obviously knows already that the ground has already melted away from his feet. So there is this recognition of gender as well. As I said in the beginning, lots of women are being mobilized, and they are actually looking for an alternative way of life which would give them dignity. Kisani is not simply about wages, but it's also about dignity. And this dignified life, they are realizing, will be possible only if we have a new idea of solidarity, which transcends their own site of being Jatts. But at the same time, there are also limitations of it, how far it will go. And I keep saying that social movements are not just moments of being. Sociologically speaking, these are, as I said, movements of Jatts, for the Jatts, by the Jatts, but they are also moments of becoming, right? Social movements are the time when you mobilize, when you are going together in a tractor and you are creating new bhaichara. Bhaichara is fraternity with the Dalit, and you would sit together, eat together, and would talk to each other very differently because your own struggle depends on their support. That then kind of becomes a moment of reflection, and that moment of becoming then opens up many possibilities. So this is a moment which is a very creative moment. If COVID was not there, I think many more people from middle classes would have also joined them. And there is other larger context in which this movement is being seen as a source of hope by lots of people in India. I think I've already spoken more than I should have spoken, but I thought the narrative was not really getting over unless I said everything. Yeah, you are muted.
I said we could listen to you for a long time. I envy your students who get you in a classroom and you engage them in this way. You've taken us into a really historical trajectory, into the current moment, and then into the future. So you have covered all bases of a lecture, I think, very well, and a fascinating lecture for sure. I like you, hopeful. At the end of your lecture, you talk about this movement of becoming, and we are all, I think, in support of a movement of becoming into a movement of solidarity, a movement of shifting cultural norms and practices. So I think you leave us with a hopeful moment that this movement maybe over time make the annals of history as a time of change, of space, of cultural belonging, of cultural makeup, however we want to address it. But I think you're right that we need to wait a bit and see what happens, because in the heat of the moment, there can be a lot of promises, and whether they come to fruition will take time to understand. I'm also really impressed by your ideas of reconciliation that have happened in the village scene, and you've really evoked, for those of us who have lived in village lives or have some connections with Indian villages, it has really brought a new perspective, I think, to our thinking. There are some amazing conversations going on the sidebar in the chat that we don't want you to, just be distracted by, but I will pose some questions for you. We have about 20 minutes, 15 minutes to take questions, and we'll try to end around 10:30. And if people have to leave for meetings, they can do that. We may stay a few minutes longer. But thank you so much, Dr. Jodhka, for your life's work in this area, and for being able to give us the story of Punjab in this amazing landscape that has brought everything into sharper focus for us. And we may have known these things, but you have made them more clear for all of us. So thank you, and good wishes for the future as you do your research, continue to do your research. So we have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose for you. This is one about the interest rates. You talked about the lenders, the mandis, they're having, like banks. Could you talk about what those current rates are and what the proposed extended rates are in relation to what we pay for credit cards and for debts that we have in Canada? What is that rate of interest that these mandis are charging as like banks?
It varies from both lender to lender, and also amount that you borrow. Sometime they don't charge you anything because there are big landlords, big farmers who would leave their money with them. They would not take, for example, if you sell them, say 100 tons of wheat, and you're not very keen on taking money, but if you also overdraw, they would not charge you anything. But if you're a small cultivator, you have nothing. The typical rate is 2% monthly. That would work out to be 24% annually, but it is calculated monthly. So, but it could also go to 3% if you don't have any. For example, it is on the basis of crop mortgage, that you give assurance that whatever farm I'm producing, I would bring to you. Sometimes it is also a kind of commercial transaction, in the sense that farmer will go and pick up fertilizer bags from the commission agent, and the commission agent will make an account. So you don't really formally pay an interest, but you would be paying back all that money that you have you have taken from in form of commodities through your own commodity that is farm produced. So it's a very kind of complicated relationship, but it is also part of the same ecosystem. They feel very secure there. Here again, there was a kind of up to 1980s, there was a conflict between farmers and the commission agents. During the Khalistan movement, that also became an issue because most of the commission agents were urban Mahajans and Khatris. They were from urban trading castes, and the farmers were all Jatts. So, and I was saying that in the 90s, they began to diversify. Many of them, the Jatt farmers became commission agents in the mandis. Oh. So now half the commission agents in Punjab are themselves farmers.
Okay.
They are Jatts and they are Jatt Sikhs normally, right? So there's all kinds of kinship relationship, and then they would take these pesticides from them and fertilizers from them. But normally interest rates are a kind of not more than 20%, 2% per month, which works out to be 24% annually. But it is calculated monthly. But it could also be 1.5%. It could be 1%. It could be even the 3%. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That makes it much clearer. So assuming, I have a question from Gary, assuming that wheat and paddy cultivation in Punjab must adapt to remain economically and environmentally viable, do you believe that the central government honestly thinks that these market reforms would bring about the necessary change to transform agriculture? Or was it a bending to corporate desires without consideration of the economic fallout for farming families and by extension, caste-based laborers?
No, they have had no consultation. See, the problem is, paddy is a crisis. Green revolution is a problem. In Punjab, there is water tables are declining. Quality of food grain does not carry as much, what one should say, value in the Indian market because Punjab is seen as overusing fertilizers. So Punjab farmers know this. And they are actually saying that you did not consult us when you introduced Green Revolution, and you don't want to consult us either now, right? So they are hoping that only market mechanisms would resolve this crisis. If something are not sold, they would stop producing, and they need to be given that kind of bitter pill. Otherwise, they would not listen. So instead of making it a kind of cooperative, participatory decision-making process, farmers are very desperate to diversify. Yeah. And actually what they are asking for, to me, makes much more sense, that you give us price security of different crops. Yeah. See, Punjab had something like 16 crops before Green Revolution. Now it has only 9 crops. Right? Nearly 2/3 of the entire cultivable area is under wheat and paddy. Punjab can produce wheat, but paddy, it can avoid producing so much. It can bring down significantly. But many farmers say that the moment we diversify into potato cultivation, for one season, we will earn good money, but next season, we are not able to sell potato. So you give us price guarantee, and that can be done easily by the state, even if they are selling it to corporate sector. See, agriculture is not a socialist sector in India. Yeah. It's already privatized, right? It is market related. But what they want the state to do is to kind of recognize their vulnerability and give them price security. If they give them price security for different crops, farmers would be willing to experiment, and then they'll move out of paddy. Right? But if you don't give them price security, they'll come back to paddy because this at least gives you a survival subsistence crop, the classical peasant economy anxiety that you need security before you earn profit. So that is the trap, that trap can end only when you kind of work with farmers rather than kind of, work through corporates and hope that, the classical open market, free market competition that is not going to work. That will create more crisis, and given the numbers, it would actually politically also not be, and it's already there. Politically, it is going to be costly for the regime. And there was a related question you were saying?
No, just around farming families, how they're going to economically suffer because of this, and laborers, like there's already a labor shortage in Punjab or in other regions. Isn't that going to create even more challenges?
Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, labor question is complicated because on the one hand, there's labor shortage. On the other hand, there is unemployment. Punjab has one of the highest unemployment in India. So it's the match, right? You educate your children, and then if the job is available at a very low value and low dignity, they don't want to work. So there are all kinds of issues. But for that, you need kind of, a different thinking.
Yes. So what would you say are some of the main achievements of the movement till now, and what is the role of the magazine Karti Dharti?
Trolley times.
Is it trolley times? The poll question is Kadi Dharti, Karti Dharti. Is there such a magazine?
I'm not sure.
Aware of that. But what are the main, what do you think are the main achievements of the movement? And is there a stalemate right now?
Well, at some level there is stalemate, but achievement is that, for example, we are talking about it. Right? Post 1990s, agriculture had gone completely to the margin of intellectual discussion. I think the movement has already become successful. Is that agriculture has now, nobody can ignore agriculture. And no regime in future, in next coming 20, 30 years, will take farming lobbies so lightly. So the fact that they've been able to sustain this movement for so long, and the loss to the state is massive. It's not like only farmers are wasting money. They are sitting on all the toll bridges in Northwest India. So the central government or the ministry that builds roads are not able to collect any tolls from anywhere. And daily losses are quite significant. I mean, these are main roads. And there are many other losses that central government is experiencing, but they are kind of trying to put a brave face. But I think it's a major achievement of the farmers' movement that the whole world is talking about them. And as we were earlier thinking that hopefully politically it would have many different kinds of implications for the Indian democracy. So the only section in last, in India has, now globally it is recognized that we have a democratic recede in India. And this has been the most effective of political movements which has come from below, and it has come from dominant communities of the rural section. Poorest of the poor can't sustain these kinds of movements. It's because the Jatts have resources, it's because they have people in the diaspora that they're able to sustain it. Otherwise, if they were kind of small marginal farmers of Bihar, they would have disintegrated within 2-3 days. So
you mentioned that the labor movement, the labor unions are really engaged, and they're the lobbyists behind it, and they're the leaders have come forward. And we have noticed that political leaders are not being given the front seat and the podium. How about, can you speak to any women leaders that have come forward? We know of the cases of the women who were jailed and who were released post bail, but have there been some women leaders that we know of? One that was the Dalit leader, but others that have come forward? You mentioned them in passing.
Oh yeah, quite a few of them. I mean, they are all the leaders. I mean, I'm collecting data on all these farmers' unions. Their frontline leaders are all men. They're all Jatts. And they all, I mean, the age varies. Some of them are in their 30s, some of them are in the 70s, but they're more or less, from the same kind of social composition. But at the second, third level, there are lots of women. I mean, I'm not really, but I know, for example, this woman in Ugraha, BKU Ekta Ugraha, the vice president is a woman. There are many other functionaries who are women. They mobilize actually lots of women. But more importantly, women are coming and sitting there, even on the Singhu border, where you have kind of people from the Akali background. And these singers are openly saying from the stage, because, this langar tradition requires a lot of labor in the kitchen. And most of the kitchen work is being done by men. And they're saying that now these men who never worked in the kitchen, here they are compelled to make rotis. And when they go back home, hopefully the old woman can tell her son to cook food in the kitchen because he's now learning cooking. These kinds of cultural practices are being talked about, which I think, again, very feminist in some ways. And they are being talked about as actually politically and in a very routine way. It's not something people are making fun of, but they are saying that this is an achievement of the movement. They are very proud of the fact that, now men know how to cook. And this chap say, "Mai tera tak kaam sokha ho gaya." Mother, now your work has become easier. Now, when you go back home, you don't have to only tell your daughter and daughter-in-law to cook. This man is now as good as your daughter is. So I think this is a new narrative.
Yeah, that would be change. Yeah, that would be see change in Punjab for sure. Dr. Jodhka, just around reservation, the issue of reservation, one of the defining factors of division between rural and urban and Dalits and non-Dalits has been around the government legal processes around reservation, and university students are disenchanted by seats that are reserved for reserved people. Do you think that that plays a role still in dividing the caste-based narratives that happen in Punjab, and whether it's rural or urban?
Well, it hasn't come up here. Actually, on the contrary, farmers have been celebrating all the Dalit festivals. I mean, last week they had Ambedkar Jayanti. Before that, they celebrated Ravidasi Jayanti. And they are very conspicuously, publicly, demonstratively trying to show that we love Dalit icons as much as Dalits do. And we need to sit together and we would promote Dalit cause. Reservation has increasingly become a non-issue, and it is becoming a non-issue all over the country because there are no government jobs available. Right? Education also is kind of in doldrums. Public universities are in bad shape. Private universities have no reservation for Dalits. So I don't see any, I mean, even in otherwise Punjab universities or the universities of Punjab, reservations are not really sources of contention. So they have come to be accepted at some level, but at another level, it doesn't really, I mean, the Jatt boys who want to study, girls who want to study, they get enough seats. It's not like there's no space for them to study.
Dr. Jodhka, you mentioned that a large percentage of populations in all villages in Punjab is made up of Dalits and lower caste that we consider, I hate to use the term, but what has been classified. Is there national data that's available now to show land ownership, and whether that land ownership is shifting a little bit because landless peasants are being able to purchase land, whether they're from UP or Bihar or wherever in Punjab? Is that shifting a bit, or is there national data on that?
Yeah, there is data, plenty of data on land ownership caste-wise, because there's a kind of caste listing of Dalits as scheduled castes. So the land ownership among scheduled caste has not gone up in the last 50, 60 years or 70 years. So the land markets, it's very difficult for a Dalit to buy land. In some areas, because Dalit movements have been powerful, village common land has been given to Dalits. But in Punjab, I don't think that has happened. The land titles have not been transferred. Dalits have been fighting over land lease from the panchayats. Earlier, the land was also leased in by the upper caste, dominant caste Jatts. Even when it is reserved for, there is a kind of reservation in land lease at the village level. So they would bring their laborer and they would take land from the village panchayat on the name of the laborer. So that became a source of contention for some time, but that also now has been more or less settled. So some of the Dalits do work on panchayat lands, but as leased in land. But they're not really, many of them as enterprising farmers because they don't have resources. In order to cultivate, you need social networks. In order to cultivate, you need to have kind of some cultural tradition of cultivation. It's also risky. If a Dalit goes and asks for money from the commission agent in Mandi Adatiya, they are unlikely to get it. So Dalits would also not prefer going in agriculture if they have resources. They would want to diversify in non-farm occupations. They would set up a shop in the village or in the town, but not in agriculture, because agriculture is seen as a kind of Jatt domain, and because there are all kinds of masculine contests that you have to be part of. In the village, there are conflicts over small borders of, unless you are able to put up those physical fights, you are not able to sustain yourself in farming. So farming is tough in many different ways, and Dalits have found it difficult, particularly in regions like Punjab. In UP, yes, I mean, there are some regions where Dalits have lands. In UP, historically, 25% of the scheduled caste are listed as cultivators, right? Because the Western UP, particularly Chamars, have historically had land. They were tenants, and from when land reforms happened, because these were zamindari areas, the Chamars also got some land as titles. But Punjab historically was different. So Punjab Dalits did not, only around 3% of them are cultivators, listed as cultivators. But the data is available, caste-wise, ownership over agricultural land across states.
Do you believe, the last question I'm going to pose before we vote of thanks, do you believe that the solidarity that you've spoken about between the upper caste and lower caste that's showing up in this farmers movement is sustainable? And do you believe that in the past that there have been examples where Dalits have been valued and benefited from these movements?
I don't think there have been any such movements in the past. And the fact that, as I said, already rural is becoming very different. It's no longer an autonomous site. I've seen in Haryana also with neo-religious movements, sections who are downwardly mobile among the dominant castes, they, along with Dalits, would go together to deras. For example, these religious sites which are kind of outside the Sikh religious framework. So their new kind of solidarities have emerged. But these are downwardly mobile people from agricultural castes and sections of Dalits and lower other kind of OBCs or other backward classes. So there are kind of new possibilities. But how far will it happen? I don't think caste is going to go away. The resources, apart from land, that Jatts have are many, many times more, including the music industry and the diasporic connections. And at the end of the day, you have your own bhaicharas. Marriages are not going to happen across castes.
Caste, yeah.
So unless that happens, your communities would be caste based. So yes, I mean, if there is a communication, if there is recognition that we are different, and because we are different, therefore we are equal. So that narrative, if that sets in, then there are entitlements that Dalits can claim, which they could not earlier. So there's a space for Dalits to push their case into. But it's not going to happen. As a sociologist, all of us know it's not so easy. But things have changed. Same is the case with gender question. Women would then have to keep reminding them, at that morcha you were saying these things. Now you are sitting with your cousin and drinking and not doing anything. And women will have to kind of hold stick in their hand and actually hit them hard. Otherwise, men are men. I mean, they're not going
to. So says a man. But I'm very, very appreciative, and I'm sure the rest of the audience is as well. And I really thank everyone for joining us, sticking with us. We're at about 10:32. I don't want to take up more of your time and let you have your rest, which I'm sure is much needed for the work that you are doing right now. You have really enlightened us in terms of both the history and the current state. And you have taken us, as I said, into the future where we hope it is brighter and better for both for farmers and for our cultural communities and all of us. Thank you from all of us, from Inder and myself especially, who I didn't know you, but Inder introduced you to me. I thank you for taking the time with us, valuable time of yours with us. Any parting words that you might want to impart to us?
Thank you very much. Look forward to looking at your work as well. And let's hope we can kind of interact more actively in future. Yeah.
We hope so too. We are going to be looking at the lyrics of the popular music, as you had mentioned earlier in your talk. We are starting a study of the lyrics that are coming out of the farmers' protest movement, and we're actually also looking to see if the diaspora is responding in any way to towards the folk music from this side. So we're doing a study of those.
Oh yes, yeah. Canadian singers have gone to the farm sites. I know 3-4 of them. Just all the way from Canada, and spent a week there, and then they've perhaps gone back to Canada. And they have played a very active role, and they've also perhaps donated them a lot of money from their funds.
Yes. Thank you again. Please.
Thank you so much for listening to me. I really enjoyed talking to you. I felt good, even though it's a screen interaction. But I think you get vibes, kind of, as teachers, we all the time are interacting now with screens. But thank you very much for listening to me. It's been wonderful engaging with you.
Appreciate it greatly. And we hope you will visit Canada soon.
Let's hope so.
And our place. Thank you so much.
Virtually. Good day for you.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see such lovely, familiar faces on the screen as well. Thank you, everyone.
Agnes, are you able to stop recording?
Should I?